Hello, everyone. I'm Farwa Aamer, Director of South Asia Initiatives at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this important virtual conversation on Bangladesh's political challenges, what comes next, jointly hosted by ASPI and the Asia Society India Center. On August 5th, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina resigned and left Bangladesh following weeks of intense and deadly nationwide protests. The unrest initially sparked in July by student-led demonstrations demanding the abolition of the government's controversial quota system, which reserved 30% of civil service positions for relatives of veterans from Bangladesh's 1971 War of Independence. While the protests began peacefully, the situation quickly escalated, culminating in the abrupt end of Hasina's nearly 15-year tenure. However, these events were not isolated. Tensions had been simmering even before the January elections. Now, with an interim government led by Nobel Laureate Dr. Yunus at the helm, the country faces significant uncertainty, and the coming months will be critical. Key questions loom. Can the interim government stabilize the country and help restore law and order? What does the future hold for its democracy? And how will these developments impact the region and the broader global community? To unpack all this and more, I'm delighted to be joined by Sreeradha Dutta, Professor of International Affairs, OP Jindal University, and author of Bangladesh on a New Journey, Moving Beyond Regional Identity. Michael Kugelman, Director of the Wilson Center's South Asia Institute and author of Foreign Policy's Weekly South Asia Brave. Shafqat Munir, Senior Fellow at the Bangladesh Institute of Peace and Security Studies, and Sara Hossain, who will be joining us shortly, Professor of Practice at the School of Law, Gender and Media at SOAS, and partner at the law firm of Dr. Kamal Hossain and Associates. Thank you all for joining me today. So without further ado, if I could just start with you, Sreeradha, the recent political turmoil has highlighted the many fissures in Bangladesh's politics, economy, and security situation. You've studied Bangladesh's democracy and political processes for years now. Can you help set the stage for us and very briefly walk us through what the history of the country's politics tells us about the events of last week and what we are currently seeing, and how these events really did not happen in a vacuum? Over to you, Sreeradha.
Thanks, Farwa. Let me very briefly go over the history as you suggested. One of my earliest works on Bangladesh was called Bangladesh, a Fragile Democracy. Unfortunately, many years later, we stand here in 2024 and we say it's still a very fragile democracy. If you recall, even during Mujib's time, he had initiated an experiment with a single party system. Soon after, of course, we had 2 years of 15 years of military leadership that had ruled Dhaka at that point of time. But it also paved the way to kind of understand that Bangladesh does not favor that kind of a presidential or military leader. So that was one thing which was out there in the open, which exists even today. But 1991 restored multi-party democracy. But what we have seen over the years is the two main political parties, and it's always been a contestation between the two main political parties, which is BNP, which has been led by Khalida Zia, or Awami League, which has been led by Sheikh Hasina. And unfortunately, every time, whichever leader has been in power, they've had to constantly try and adjust the system to their advantage. They've often, kind of made systemic changes to ensure that their position contains and remains there. And again, Bangladesh barely ever had any choice but between the two political parties. There were other political parties, but they've always in kind of a coalition form, never as the two major entities. And also dynastic politics in Bangladesh. It's been very, very entrenched. And this is what I feel right now, this particular moment, which is called revolution, which is being called Bangla Boshanto, which is similar to what Arab Spring is going to be a breakthrough. What I feel is that has going to change. The last 15 years has been especially significant because of the fact while Bangladesh has trebled its economy, and it was, I think, about a year and a half ago, one of the fastest growing nations in Asia, but it's done a very deep nosedive just now economically. Its forex is down to about 3 months of maintenance, I think, at this point of time. A GDP, which was at some time 5-6 years ago 7.5, 7.6, is now less than 4. Highest rate of inflation. highest rate of unemployment. And, and that, of course, links me to this youth, which is we call about the dividend youth, but they're about 38% of the population and completely deprived of opportunities and jobs. So this particular movement, the trigger of the quota, was also, there were years of frustration about how this particular government led by Sheikh Hasina had completely, it was the deep-seated cronyism that we saw, corruption that we saw, was something that they were dealing with on a day-to-day basis. But when this particular one, when the quota problem started, the movement, it was a demand for some very basic, which is not anything about the government or anything even dealing with the moving the quota system completely out, but very logical sequence of things. But completely nobody had any ear to that. And that's when it turned into a step down. The government had to step down. But I think the years of frustration, the years of seeing out how many leaders were completely using the system to their advantage, leaving a large part of the youth and the constituencies out, and the fact that the last 3 elections were anything but free and fair. So a large section of the first-time voters were left out of the loop, and that's not something. Bangladesh has always had a very, very invested electorate. So many of these factors actually boiled up into to see the system that what we saw on 5th August, where she had to flee the country in the face of the wrath of the youth. And of course, the entire country rallied around the youth. It was the first of Dhaka University, the public university, but every single university across the districts joined. And we saw people from all walks of life, not only the families and parents of the students, but everybody from every corner of life supported this particular movement. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And that's very helpful background. And to reiterate, how he said the last few elections were not free and fair. Again, it seems like there was a lot that was happening that led to eventually the events of last week and what we've been seeing. And with that, if I could come to you, Shafqat, you've been on the ground seeing this all play out. What were your first reactions when the news broke out about Sheikh Hasina's resignation? And now with the new interim government sewn in under Dr. Mohammed Yunus, this is no easy period to navigate for Bangladesh. Do you see this new interim government as a credible, legitimate sort of entity, and it's inclusive enough to lead the country to stability, paving the way for eventually a democratically elected government to come in? Over to you, Shafqat.
Thank you, Farwa. It's a pleasure to be here. I would echo many of the sentiments Dr. Sreeradha Dutta has expressed. And I would say from the ground, when the news broke, ours was a sense of jubilation, one of rejoice and relief. Relief because we have been through an anxious couple of weeks where every day we were waking up to new figures of people killed, people wounded. We were also seeing a government which was bent on, we were also seeing a government which was absolutely bent on killing people in order to survive in power. So that nightmare had ended. So that was a huge relief for us. For those of us who live in Bangladesh, this did not come as a surprise. This was years in the making. And especially since the election in January 2024, it was just a matter of time before this started. When you suppress a population of 175 million people, when you deny them voting rights, when you deny them democracy, when you deny them freedom of speech, this is what you get. I am quite hopeful, I'm quite optimistic that the new interim government under Nobel Laureate Professor Mohammed Yunus would be able to perform the task. It's a government of civil society leaders. It's a government of different professional groups. It's a government of different minority groups. It's a government which also has been very careful in terms of its gender balance. And it's a government which is keen to pursue an aggressive reform agenda, overhaul this country, and eventually pave the way for credible, free, fair elections, something which the Bangladeshi people have been denied for far too long. At this juncture, this government not only needs the support of the people of Bangladesh, but it also needs the support of the international community. Among the many things that we have to restructure, and I'll come to that later, we also have to have a complete recalibration and a revamping of our foreign policy. We also need a complete overhaul of our national security architecture. We also need to ensure that never again we go back to a point where children are shot in their eyes, when hundreds of people are killed and wounded just to keep one individual in power. So I think this is not just about one election, or this is not just about the routine tasks of a government. This is a government which is basically leading a new republic, a new Bangladesh. Yes, it's a crisis. There are challenges. For those of us in Dhaka, I call it the monsoon revolution.
Thank you, Shafqat. And it's good to see that you're hopeful with the new government. And it's unfortunate the scenes that played out and the lives that were lost. But I see Sara's joined us, and Shafqat was just sharing with us how what his first reactions were, and for most in Bangladesh, what the sentiments were following the resignation of Sheikh Hasina. But going back a little bit to the history of the country, Bangladesh has had a difficult track record when it comes to upholding human rights, political freedom, and economic equality. Sreeradha just touched upon that as well earlier. Sara, can you help us unpack this a little bit? The frustrations were clearly developing for a long time, and we've heard it from multiple sources. But coming to present day, how did this quota verdict in particular become sort of the last nail on the coffin for Hasina's rule? And what all factors truly empowered this wave of student-led protests resulting in the collapse of Hasina's government, especially from a law and order point of view? Sara, over to you.
Well, I think there are a lot of contradictions in that we saw in Sheikh Hasina's government. It first came into office, of course, I'm not talking about the 1990s, but after the period of the state of emergency in 2007 and 8, which came actually in reaction to the BNP not giving a fair election to the people of Bangladesh. And it led to effectively a kind of military-backed caretaker government. 2 years after that, when we had elections in 2008, the Awami League swept to victory. And that was also, I think it's important to start with that was a very hopeful time. For many people in Bangladesh, we felt that was a new beginning, and that actually Sheikh Hasina would help to lead that new beginning. But within a couple of, and there were many hopes from all sectors, I think, of society, from different communities, that a chapter had been turned. But within 1 or 2 years of her coming into office, we saw, just irrational and arbitrary abuse of power begin to happen. And ironically, perhaps, given where we stand now, this was perhaps most visible with the actions that Sheikh Hasina and her government took against Professor Muhammad Yunus to forcibly essentially remove him from managing directorship of Grameen Bank, of the bank which he had founded, whose, the drafting of which, the statute of which body he had pioneered back in the 80s, and which he had led to its, Nobel winning success and to taking Bangladesh also to the knowledge of people around the world and to sort of recognition and respect everywhere. So she went on this sort of vendetta, essentially, against Professor Yunus. And I think it's important to note that that vendetta was partly due to the fact that during the period of emergency, he had said that he would himself try to float a political party. That was never forgotten by her in all of these years. And that vendetta continued in about 2000, it started in 2010-11, hasn't stopped until now. And I think that was, in a sense, almost within those first 2 years, we could now, with hindsight, we could kind of foretell the beginning of the end. Because that kind of just egregious abuse of power, we could then see being manifested in all kinds of other areas. Professor Yunus, after all, was a man known to the world, famous, for all of his accomplishments. But many people, not known to the rest of the world, students, day laborers, political oppositionists, came under the same kind of treatment. And they faced, I think, as Shafqat has already explained, again, arbitrary and excessive abuse of power and also use of force repeatedly over the years, with detentions, disappearances, and simple, everyday, ordinary harassment of people. And I think what in the end, this student movement actually also had its genesis perhaps 6 years ago. I'm standing right now in front of a monument which is built to two good friends of ours and two leading figures in the cultural world in Bangladesh, two filmmakers who were killed in a car crash 13 years ago. People are here commemorating that event. And the reason why that event, unlike the rest of the world, was not just about a single incident of a car crash and perhaps negligence of an individual. The whole issue about road safety was seen as a political issue. The impunity that was given to those running bus companies, transport vehicles, the lack of enforcement of everyday ordinary laws like traffic laws and road safety laws, that led to a movement by students 6 years ago asking for justice, saying we want justice on the roads, we want justice in cases of individuals being killed on the roads, and we want to stop the impunity that we see being patronized by political elements. That was crushed 6 years ago. Students were arrested, beaten up. Many had cases hanging over their heads, which is still there till this day. And we saw how that movement came back again 6 years later in the form of the quota movement. As you explained, why did this movement happen? Again, as I was saying at the beginning, there's a kind of paradox about Sheikh Hasina's time, because there were many, she made many, her government made and delivered on promises in terms of changing legislation, putting in place policies that were about equality, that were about empowering of the marginalized. But I think the fatal flaw was that while the policies were in place, many programs were also made, there was not at the end equality before law for all. And there was political patronization to the highest level, and there was political polarization of the highest level. So if you were not within the favored circles, then you were simply going to be excluded from all kinds of benefits and opportunities. And that's really what the quota movement was about. Quotas or reservations for public sector jobs, I would say, are a good thing. I think it's important to create opportunities for marginalized communities. And it's also important at the same time to pay respect to those who fought for liberation in Bangladesh. But perhaps the two of them don't go hand in hand. And this opportunity, this decision by the government to still retain reservations for the grandchildren, the successors of freedom fighters, was seen as a way of actually, because of the the partisan interpretation of who is a freedom fighter, who could benefit, who could be eligible for these quotas, meant that these were not being seen as fair in the way in which they were applied. So students really revolted against that. Sheikh Hasina herself, instead of giving a measured response, they had asked for reform of the quotas, to have reservations established, but in a fair and equitable way, and not in a way that blocked out most young people from equal opportunities. Instead of doing that, 6 years ago, Sheikh Hasina said, I'm irritated by this. She literally used the word birukti, which means annoyance or irritation in Bangladesh, and said, I am abolishing the quota. So all reservations for everybody, indigenous people, people with disabilities, all those were removed together with the more controversial quotas for grandchildren of freedom fighters. And then when a case was filed by some people challenging the abolition of the quota, the High Court chose to give a judgment saying that the quotas could be reestablished, including for, again, grandchildren of freedom fighters. When that judgment was pronounced early in June, again, the students took to the streets of protest. Now, that matter could have been, as almost everyone in Bangladesh has now written about and spoken about, that matter could have been resolved easily, relatively easily, through political negotiation and discussion with the student protesters. All they were asking for was reform of the reservations, reduction of the numbers, rational redistribution, and so on for those who were genuinely excluded from opportunities for employment in the public sector. Instead of doing that, the government took a very hardline position. On the one hand, they took up an argument which simply had no basis legally at all. They said this entire issue of quotas can only be resolved by the courts. That is patently incorrect. The issue of quotas, which is a policy measure of who will get what reservation for what seat, is something to be taken by the executive branch of government. The students were, very clear, and they said that. They said the government, the executive branch will decide this for us. Why are we waiting for what the courts will do? This is just, misleading the entire population. But the government stuck to its guns, said, no, we're going to have this resolved by the courts. There's nothing we can do. And in the meantime, Sheikh Hasina herself made statements in her press conference saying students can stay on the streets, they can protest, they can go to court, but I'm not going to do anything until the court gives its decision. And then we had a court hearing where everybody, including the Attorney General of the then government, clearly said that the matter of determining quotas is a matter for the executive. Despite that, the Supreme Court, our highest court, the appellate division, gave an opinion saying that we are going to give a decision, make a recommendation that reservations should be made in the following categories. And following that, the government then pursued that decision, said, yeah, we're going to follow the Supreme Court decision. The entire thing was a kind of fiction almost that had been spun around everybody. But the thing that really led in the end to, I think, the change we saw in the last week is that instead of continuing the dialogue, in the end, the students were fired upon. There was a resort to force. 6 people were killed in the first round. And then after that, when there was a hiatus for a day, and then again, students went back on the streets. Public universities were closed down. Students were turfed out in the middle of the night. And the next day, private university students also took to the streets. And they were, instead of again being accepted for doing that peaceful protest on the streets, they were literally fired on point blank with live fire, and hundreds of bodies fell. As soon as that happened, after that, we heard, I'll just finish, sorry, I've taken a lot of time, but just the last part. After that, we heard student after student say on their Facebook posts, elsewhere to each other, that I don't need quotas. I'm not a person who's going to qualify for a quota. I don't care about quotas. What I care about is my brother or my sister has been killed in cold blood, and I'm going to fight till this stops. So I think that's what really turned the whole thing around. And for many adults, for people who are not students, we saw that happening, children falling to the ground. And I think people said, this is too much. In a country where we've already had, where, we came to birth through a genocide, people can't accept that kind of killing. It's simply, that's the end. That was the bottom line. And I think that's what finished it.
Thank you, Sara. Again, the unfortunate events and what you said, there's a lot of paradox going on during Sheikh Hasina's rule, and what we've been hearing is this fairly politics favoritism, freedom of speech being curbed, there's a lot of justice denied, but that's what we've been seeing on the ground. But coming to you now, Michael, you've been following the chain of events very closely. Whatever has been happening in Bangladesh has implications beyond what we just see on the ground. It certainly means something for how the country will interact with important global and regional actors on the scene. It has relevance for South Asia on the whole as well, in particular. And we'll talk about India separately, but I would like to get a sense from you as to how you are seeing the impacts on the neighborhood, including Pakistan, Nepal, and others. And as I understand that China and the United States are following these developments very closely as well, what can we expect in terms of foreign policy recalibrations, both from within and outside of Bangladesh? Over to you, Michael.
Right. So far, the crisis in Bangladesh has largely been an internal one with no notable spillover effects in the region. It's been a very serious and, of course, a very tragic crisis with hundreds of lives lost. But everything, for the most part, has been contained to Bangladesh. Now, I think that certainly there might be an exception in the context of India, which I know will be discussed later. India has significant border security concerns, and of course, the Sheikh Hasina factor, with Hasina being in India for the time being. But I know that'll be discussed separately. So it is a crisis that has been contained to Bangladesh for now, but yes, as you say, there's significant amounts of interest, all for the wrong reason, so to speak, in the region and around the world. The major issue is concern about restoring law and order and stability. Bangladesh, it has commercial partnerships with many countries, from the fact that it receives infrastructure investments from China, from Japan, from Russia. It has important trade relationships with many countries across the world, including the U.S. And the U.S. and EU are the two of the top export destinations for Bangladesh. It has a number of key energy partnerships with several countries in the Middle East that supply Bangladesh with hydrocarbons. So all of these countries will be and are worried about the security of their assets and their investments and their equities. And they'll continue to be concerned until we start to see a restoration of law and order, until we start to see a degree of stabilization. There's not a massive presence of foreign companies in Bangladesh compared to India, but there are a number of large global companies that are based there, and that includes a number of foreign energy companies. And they're very concerned about the stability situation, and also just the fact that you have a fair degree of uncertainty about what's coming next. I mean, the pathway to a peaceful transition, it's unclear what's going to happen beyond the interim government at this point. And these are things that certainly have many countries in the region and beyond worried. I think that for now, until we start to see stabilization being restored, most foreign governments will keep a low profile in the sense that they're not going to be saying much publicly. They're not going to go out of their way to suggest that they want to get involved in what's happening, and so on. But if and when security and stabilization are restored, I think there will be a number of new opportunities for the international community. Starting with the region, I think that Pakistan may potentially be one of the biggest beneficiaries. Pakistan has not really had much of a relationship with Bangladesh for a number of years. I mean, this of course all goes back to 71, of course, but Pakistan has refused to apologize for its brutalities and its role in 1971, and that in the Awami League era and the Sheikh Hasina era really made it difficult to move things forward. When Imran Khan was prime minister, he had actually reached out to Sheikh Hasina. He had a call with her. There were letters exchanged, but things didn't really get that far. It likely was in great part because Sheikh Hasina did not want to do anything that could risk upsetting India. That might not be as much of a limitation right now. And I'm not saying that we're going to see Pakistan and Bangladesh scale up their relations in a big way, but I do think that, the very new political realities in Bangladesh could actually be very helpful for Pakistan as it looks for efforts to find new friends in a region where it does not really have many close partnerships. China will definitely have opportunities, I think. This new government in Bangladesh will welcome continued investment, continued engagement from China. And I think it will not feel constrained by the need not to get too close to China due to concern about upsetting India. And of course, we know in the Sheikh Hasina era, Bangladesh's relations with China actually grew in a big way, right? We talk all about this special relationship that Sheikh Hasina and her government had with India. But let's not forget that Bangladesh's relations with economic and defense relations with China were scaled up in a big way. But in that context, I think that there were limitations to how far Dhaka was willing to go because of its special relationship with India. That is not necessarily going to be as much of a factor, and that could help China. That could certainly be a good thing for Beijing. But again, Beijing, I think, will only be comfortable engaging with this new government once it's assured about the security situation. Now, in terms of the U.S., definitely, there's an opportunity with the interim government. Dr. Yunus, of course, is someone that the U.S. is comfortable with. I think it will want to build on what had been. Let's not forget pretty good relations in the Hasina years. Despite all the controversies and the distractions about with the U.S. public pressure on Bangladesh on elections and rights, U.S.-Bangladesh relations actually grew pretty significantly in recent years, particularly on the trade side in terms of strategic cooperation. But I think it's too early to say what Bangladesh will do on foreign policy with this new government. I don't think in the immediate term foreign policy will be a priority. The focus will be on other domestic issues, but I would highlight two key initial foreign policy priorities that this new government will have. One is the issue of India and Hasina. I know this will be discussed later, but this new government is clearly focused on India just because the Sheikh Hasina is in India for now. Myanmar, I think, is another immediate foreign policy issue that's going to have to be addressed. I mean, we know that the war there in Myanmar has intensified in recent years. Reportedly, attacks on Rohingya there are starting to increase. So there's a very real risk of spillover effects into Bangladesh increasing, along with the possibility of more surges of refugees. And the military, the army in Bangladesh has been diverted by the crisis in Bangladesh. So I think there's concerns about border security implications. To conclude, eventually we will see the interim government reach out to key commercial partners to ensure that relations are intact. This is important as part of economic stabilization efforts. More broadly, I really expect a fair level of continuity with the previous government when it comes to foreign policy, with the core principle of a balancing policy. I don't think that this new government will want to be associated with the friendship with all, malice to none idea, because that's very much linked to the Awami League. But the new government will likely focus on the same policy. There's no one in this interim government who's a foreign policy maverick, someone who would want to shake things up in a big way. The foreign affairs advisor is actually a former deputy high commissioner to India. He's a level-headed former diplomat. He said that Bangladesh will want smoother relations with the world. He's talked of a balanced foreign policy, and there's nothing new about this. It's a continuation of Bangladesh's longstanding foreign policy. I do think that Dr. Yunus will want to see Bangladesh take care to ensure its relations with the US and EU, two top export destinations, are in a good place, particularly with the economy having suffered in recent months and especially in more recent weeks. And he's helped by the fact that, as we all know, he has a lot of supporters and admirers in Western capitals. So back to you, Farwa.
Thank you very much, Michael. That you're very right to point out that first, domestically, things need to be all right. But there's a lot of important stuff that's happening around Bangladesh's borders. And of course, China's interests closely tied to the security and stability of Bangladesh itself. So these months and weeks will be critical. And we'll be seeing things, how they unfold. But let's quickly talk about India, because we touched upon it. And Michael, you raised a point in the importance of the border that India shares, 4,100-kilometer border with Bangladesh, important trade ties. And under Hasina in particular, India's cultivated a very important relationship with Bangladesh. She is there at the moment. And as Minister of External Affairs said, she arrived on a short notice, the next steps unknown at the moment. But India has many interests at stake. Sreeradha, if I could come to you to very briefly share with us, how is India planning to work with the new interim government to ensure that the relationship not only survives, but possibly thrives when things are stabilized and settled in the future? Over to you, Sreeradha.
I think this is a good way to break the binary that India is always perceived to be following. First, of course, the immediate concerns would be, the safety of the Indian citizens who live and work in Bangladesh. I think around 10,000 of them have come back home safely, but they're still there who continue to reside in different parts of Bangladesh, including Dhaka. And of course, the immediate concern, given in the aftermath of 5th August event, that the kind of brutality that was unleashed on minorities. We've seen many of our borders have a huge number of people moving towards India. And there has been, I am not sure how many have been actually migrated into India, but clearly there was a fear persecution that followed in the violence that we saw, which was unleashed. But I've been told from yesterday, things have been brought down. The security forces are back in action and things will settle down. So hopefully that particular immediate concern will be taken care of. But as you say, the larger concern, of course, is, Sheikh Hasina continues to be in Delhi at this point of time in India. And we also know, and it's no secret that India has always worked very well with Awami League. There's a historical aspect to that, right, from Mujibur Rahman and the Liberation War, and subsequently Sheikh Hasina. We've also had an extremely difficult time during the BNP regime, which is especially 2001 to 2006, which is why India can't get out of those horror memories. And Sheikh Hasina had really addressed a security concern, which is a core priority vis-a-vis Bangladesh. And of course, what I think is the two of us have not only worked bilaterally very well, also the regional landscape is just about to unearth. It's going to be the kind of new agreements that we've signed in the last few years, cross-border facilities, economic corridor, value chain, all of that would mean that, there's a sub-region in South Asia which will start working together. I am very convinced that despite the fact that India has worked very closely with Sheikh Hasina Awami League, it will be just as open to work with any new government. Because Bangladesh is essential for India. A variety of reasons, not only just security, economics, and cultural aspects, many other aspects. The day-to-day contract that we have, as you know, India issues the highest number of visas for any overseas is Bangladeshis. So for whether it's medical tourism and other kind of tourism that Indians have, we don't want to lose that, right? Because that's a lot of commerce advantage for us when these people are coming, and all over India, the hospitals have Bangladeshi visitors. At the same time, we've seen the light of, the trade, bilateral trade has again doubled in the last few years. Of course, much of that is dependent on the RMG. Again, that will depend on what Michael was saying and how, we have Bangladesh moving, graduating, and Europe, of course, was very clear as to they were not going to do the negotiation. Now, I think that's, again, hopefully things will go in place. So I'm very convinced, just as for India, Bangladesh is a very critical partner. Bangladesh will also see the advantage of working with India. I essentially believe that governments on both sides need to deliver to its own people. And you can only deliver to your own people when you work together. In today's interconnected world, there is no way. And, the Bangladeshi youths are extremely upbeat about what is happening in India. Every time I've met them, they keep track of India's economic growth story. They see our IT revolution. They are very, the space technology is something they're very enthused about. So there are lots of things about India which excites them. And it's a very aspirational to do well together, right? So I'm sure the youths will find synergy together. We just have to find the right connects. Maybe everything will be not as business as usual because there were several agreements, and we've talked about that earlier, about how Bangladesh somehow didn't see the logic as to why Bangladesh signed that with India. And the one big gap has always been that, the most emotive element for Bangladesh has been water. Unfortunately, despite being such a strong development partner, we have not been able to sign anything on that. I think it's time that we re-examine some of these outstanding issues which continue to create irritants on both sides. And again, a word that we often use, that we have to work on building trust with each other again. And I'm convinced that governments on both sides will find reasons and rationale to work together in the days to come ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And like you said, it's time to re-examine. It's time for introspection to see what were the challenges and how can India work with the new government and build trust, which is very important. I know, Shafqat, you have to leave. So very quickly, I do want to come to you. And before I go to Michael to talk a little bit more about regionalism, because we're not over with the implications overall for what's beyond Bangladesh yet. So, Shafqat, the student protests, they've highlighted structural changes, some of which you kind of indicated in your initial remarks as well, that despite the economic growth, there is a challenge there. Joblessness was a challenge, of course. It's a challenge. From a development perspective, Bangladesh is set to graduate from the LDC status in 2026. So with the current situation in mind, what economic, structural, institutional reforms do you see necessary to address the challenges that are perhaps the most important ones for the country's growing population, and particularly the youth in this matter? Over to you, Shafqat.
Thank you. The interim government will have to take on a very aggressive reform agenda. And it has to start with stabilizing the economy, creating an investment climate, completely overhauling and repairing the banking industry. According to Center for Policy Dialogue, the premier economic think tank in the country, 92,000 crore plus taka, which translates into roughly 7.8 billion US dollars, has been siphoned off the banking sector. Now, mind you, that is just basically a partial statistic. We are still trying to come to terms with how much money has actually been taken away. So that has to be addressed. Corruption, as Sara Hossain was saying earlier, corruption is at the core of the grievances that the students and the population were trying to articulate. Corruption has to be addressed. Institutions which have been completely and utterly politicized. There was a remark by our chief advisor who said, Professor Yunus, that the entire body of the state has gone rotten. We have to repair limb by limb. So that is the extent of the damage. Politicization at every level. The Securities and Exchange Commission has to be reformed. So this is just the fiscal sector. If I talk about other sectors, massive overhaul needs to be done with the Election Commission in order to bring back the credibility of the election process. Let us remember that under Sheikh Hasina, the credibility of the election process was compromised. So unless we do that, we will not be able to have a free, fair, and credible election which the people want. There is also an urgent need to look at our education sector. There is a lot of grievances among the population about the way the curriculum was tampered with under the previous government. But I think the first order of business for the new interim government would be to stabilize the economy. As Michael very correctly said, restore investor confidence, make a climate where investors want to come back to Bangladesh. They are also assured of its stability, and improve the economic condition. We had a period where we had a great economic performance, but right now, for at least the last couple of years post-COVID, the economy has been going through some major turmoil. So stabilizing that would be a key agenda. Further afield, as I was saying earlier, there needs to be a critical look at our foreign policy. There needs to be a critical look. I mean, we cannot be hidebound in the kind of policy which was pursued by saying friendship with all, malice to none. Those days are over. We really need to look ahead. We really need to look ahead what kind of foreign policy we should have. I'm also urging everyone to do a complete stock take of our national security architecture and see how the national security architecture can be revamped and revitalized to address the new challenges. So in sum, Farwa, I would say it needs to be a very aggressive agenda, but it also needs to be a very time-bound agenda, because some of these things can take years. But the Bangladeshi people want this to be done. And the whole aspiration of what I call the monsoon revolution is that we want to create a new Bangladesh, a Bangladesh which will start a fresh chapter. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shafqat. Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us. Bangladesh with a fresh chapter, something that lies on the shoulder of the interim government, but eventually all in the hands of a fresh elected government to take forward. Michael,
thank you for having me.
Thank you, Shafqat. Coming back to you, Michael, one thing that interests me, and we talked about this earlier in the discussion, it was highlighted that Bangladesh needs support of the international community, and it has to work with partners, restore investor confidence, of course, working with EU, working with China. But the future of regionalism in South Asia is a very interesting case study. SAARC's role has unfortunately diminished massively, but BIMSTEC and BBIN have become prominent over the years. And they're both important for Bangladesh and Bangladesh as a core country of both these platforms. Now, with the uncertainty in Bangladesh and this complex transition period that it is going through, and we don't know how long for exactly, but how do you see Bangladesh's involvement with these important regional platforms during this interim time? But also, what are your hopes for the future? Also, what we don't talk about a lot is Bangladesh's importance to the Indo-Pacific. It developed its own outlook on the region. Will we see any sort of policy continuity with the new government, or do you see any shifts with regards to how it positions itself within the Indo-Pacific? Over to you, Mike.
Thanks. So you've rightly highlighted one of the most important geopolitical trends in South Asia, what I would describe as sub-regionalization. This is very clear that India has sought to lead efforts to scale up ties with all countries in the region except for Pakistan and Afghanistan. Pakistan and Afghanistan have been doing their own thing, but indeed this is a very notable thing. SAARC is essentially dead, and you're right. Bangladesh has indeed been a big part of this sub-regionalization effort through its roles in BIMSTEC and BBIN, and I don't see this changing with the new dispensation in Bangladesh. I think that the only possible question is if Bangladesh's relationship with India changes in a way that it would not want to partner with India in these regional multilateral groupings. I think that's highly unlikely, given how the trade and connectivity goals of these groupings, BIMSTEC, BBIN, and so on, they really serve Bangladesh's interests in a big way, and particularly in a moment when its economy is not in the best place. And in particular, there is, as you know, there is a new initiative, a trilateral initiative between Nepal, Bangladesh, and India that involves electricity sharing. There's been a lot of momentum towards getting this online and rolling, and this is very important for Bangladesh, as it is for the other two countries. And I don't see why this new government would feel that's not the case. And this gets to an important side note that I would just make very briefly, and it was made earlier by Sreeradha, and that is that, for all we talk about how this change in Bangladesh is such a blow to India and India's interest, I really think and feel quite confident that Bangladesh and India will find ways to continue to work with each other. They both need each other because of trade interests, border security considerations, great power competition considerations. And if you look at how India handled its relationship with Afghanistan after the Taliban came back to power, many thought India was really in a bad place and so on. Well, India actually, reopened its embassy in Kabul. It very quietly opened up channels of communication with the Taliban. So India's foreign policy is very flexible. It does adjust, and I think it will in this case. On the issue of the Indo-Pacific, yes, the Hasina government, I believe last year, put out an Indo-Pacific outlook, which essentially balanced the principles of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy and those of China's foreign policy. I don't expect that to change either. And this goes back to what I and others had said about an expectation of continuity more broadly in Bangladesh's foreign policy. The military cooperation components of the Indo-Pacific issue, I think, are unlikely to change. I mean, we've seen the U.S. and Bangladesh, for example, scale up maritime cooperation under the rubric of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. And I think the U.S. had a lot of concerns about the security forces cracking down in this latest crisis. And that could impact that type of cooperation if it were to conclude that there were elements of the military that the U.S. tends to work with that were involved in the crackdown. But I think it's quite clear that it was not the army, but more so the police and the paramilitary forces and others that were most involved in the crackdown. So I think U.S.-Bangladesh military cooperation within the Indo-Pacific strategy rubric will be fine too. But I'll close on this. The interim government will face the same challenge that the Hasina government did, and that is, how do you pursue a balanced, non-aligned foreign policy in an era of intensifying great power competition? I think that Bangladesh's status as a battleground for great power competition won't change, but I don't expect this new dispensation to give in to that pressure. I imagine it will continue to want to balance its relations with the U.S., with China, with India, and with Russia as well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Michael, for that. And if I could just close out with the two of you, if just getting a sense of what are the top sort of three policy priorities that you see for the interim government. Let's just talk about the interim government right now. One that we've established is to make sure that there is law and order that is restored. But beyond sort of the economic reforms that we have discussed and foreign policy recalibrations, to you both, what are the other sort of policy priorities that are important? So if I can, again, come to you, Michael, first and close it up with Sreeradha.
I think this has been a great conversation. I think that it will be important for this interim government to develop a clear pathway for its transition. And I think eventually that will entail figuring out how to approach the issue of institutional reform. I mean, these are huge, ambitious goals that will need to be achieved, quite frankly. We're talking about things like figuring out how to depoliticize key institutions. We're talking about how to set in place incentive structures that make people in government and elsewhere less willing to think that they'll receive impunity and don't have to worry about accountability. These are really huge, really big priorities. How do you do that? What is the time frame for that? And against the backdrop, there will be rising pressure for elections, not in the coming weeks or the coming months, but I think, beyond that as we get to the end of the year. And I think that this government will need to essentially come out with a strategy, with a plan for how it balances these immediate concerns about, when our election is going to happen, with these broader, ambitious policies meant to restore, rebuild the country, and try to bring Bangladesh back to a democratic state.
Thank you, Michael. Sreeradha, would you agree?
Yeah, totally. I think financial restructuring is something they just have to deal with. I mean, they'll have to do that right away because IMF credit crunch is, I think, due soon. And they have been clamoring for that for a while, which is something that, banking sector and a whole lot of other issues within the financial architecture, which it's just been a crazy way that they've trudged along for all these years. Also, what I would feel is the part that he said, that there has to be transparency in everything that they do. Every time the political leaders have wanted to be elected, but every time they've completely changed the system each time. So there's, separation of powers. You see the overreach of the executive all the time, whether judiciary, whether education sectors. Meritocracy had completely lost its way in Bangladesh. It was always in alliance with the particular allegiance of the political party. That has to break. And I think the youth and the student movement is all about that, because I don't think they want to. And I really hope, and I know this is a long shot, but I really hope and wish that some new political parties come of age, in the sense of, which is away from the dynastic politics, which is away from the usual hackneyed, landscape that they belong to. If the fresh new faces can be introduced, we've always seen in Bangladesh as elsewhere, because of the dynastic politics, fresh faces are never encouraged. The younger, unless you have a family linkages in terms of the historic baggage, nobody's encouraged to give a position. So many of the leaders leaders who are certainly very capable, certainly very efficient, have not found their space under the sun. I wish this new system, but it's nothing can happen overnight. They have to prioritize, of course, law and order, financial structure to be reformed and revamped, accountability, transparency, autonomy of organizations, and letting each one work on meritocracy. And again, to see a political landscape which allows for level playing field to every sector. It can't be just one particular hue of political color. It has to be across the spectrum, which Bangladesh for years has never encouraged. I hope we will see a bit of that now.
Thank you both. Thank you, Sreeradha. Thank you, Michael. On that hopeful note that Bangladesh indeed will have a new dawn and can move away from the disturbances of the past to a more coordinated, more consolidated future, which is inclusive and for the people of Bangladesh, really. I'm really grateful to both of you for your time, and of course to Shafqat and Sara, who joined us earlier. This was very insightful, very engaging, and thank you to all who tuned in. Please stay connected with the Asia Society Policy Institute and the Asia Society India Center. I'm very thankful to my colleagues at the India Center for making this conversation happen today. Thank you, and stay connected. All right.
Bye.